the time has come. We're going to test the theory here. Plasti-Gauge or micrometers, what's more accurate, and will they both get the job done, or is one kind of sucky? So I already started doing some work on the motor here. I'll show you what I'm up to, and then we're about ready to do a Plasti-Gauge test. So I've just kind of finishing up. I started at the back, and I'm torquing the caps down as I go. I'm going to torque this one down next. This is the next one to measure. And then we're going to get our actual micrometer inside diameter with the bearing in it. And then we're going to take all the caps back off. We're going to actually drop the crank in. We're going to Plasti-Gauge, and we're going to double check our measurements. But for now, I'm going to finish miking up, dial bore gauge, measuring all these main bores. And what I did for speed things up a little bit is, if you look here, all my main bores measure 2.558 and then whatever tenth. So 2.558, 2.558 all the way across. Or I'm sorry, I said bores. All my main journals, I should say. So what I did is I showed you in that last video how I set up this mic to just measure the first journal, and then my dial bore gauge right there, what that was going to give me if I zeroed it out to the journal size is anything over that would be my clearance size. So what I'm doing now is I reset my mic now to just 2.558. We're not going to that tenth now, because all my journals measure 2.558 and then some other fourth digit. So for speed reasons now, we got it set at 2.558. So when this is at 0, it's 2.558. So now we're going to stick it in that bore, and we're going to actually get, instead of just a clearance, we're going to actually get a bore size, or a main bore size. So what I'll do is I'm actually going to get a stand to set this up, because I got to kind of fiddle it down in here a little bit. But I'm going to get the camera stand out, and then I'll show you how I'm measuring this, how I'm actually getting not just the oil clearance now, I'm actually getting the physical journal size, main journal size. Okay, we got our main cap torqued down. What I'm going to do now is slide this into that bore. And we know that when our bore gauge here reads 0, 0 represents 2.558, our standard size. So now, if you can see this gauge here, we're going to move our bore gauge up and down a little bit here, just give it a little wiggle. We're finding where we got our tightest clearance here, our tightest spot. You can see right there, here we're reading about 2.5 thou. So we got 558 plus 2.5. We're at 560 and 5/10. So we got to remember that. 2.5605. Now we'll go write that down. All right, got my sheet going on here where I'm recording everything. So our number 3 main, we just measured it. We got, oddly enough, it was the same as number 5. So they're all measuring out pretty close to the same. But we had 2.5605/10. So now what we're going to do, some quick math. Right here. So we go 2.5605 bore size minus journal size 2.5584. 2.5584 equals 21 10,000ths of an inch. So we got just over 2 thou. So clearance is 0.0021. Like I said, my target I'm shooting for on this motor is between 2 to 2.5 thou. 2.5 thou, we're starting to get a little sloppy. 2 thou starting to get a little tight. If we fall anywhere in the middle, I'm happy with that. And we got one more journal to check, but I'm already falling in line here. We got 24 10,000ths, 21, 23, and 22. So we're all in there. We're just a touch over 2 thou. So now we'll do our last journal. Okay, I just finished my last measurement here. Got 2 thou on that. So we're in range of where I want to be. Now, what I need to do is I'm going to get all these main caps off here. Number one's off. That was the first one I did. These I had all off because I measured from the rear forward, so I had room for the tool to lay in there as each cap went on. I'm going to pull all those off, get everything real clean. Everything's got to be clean and dry to use Plasti-Gauge, and you do not want to rotate the crank. We're dropping everything in on dry bearings. We don't want to mess anything up here. And if we had oil sitting on those bearings, that would mess with our reading because oil, it's trying to compress it, so that oil takes up space. It'll change the reading we get on the Plasti-Gauge. So everything's got to be dry and clean. So for now, I'm going to get this apart, and then we are going to drop that crank in, and then that'll go in. And the Plasti-Gauge I'm using is actually, these come in different ranges. So this one I'm using here, flip this around the right way. When it's fully compressed, it'll read 2 thou. So if it's thicker than that, we're under 2 thou. So I'll show you how to use that, and we'll get going on getting that crank in. So this is Plasti-Gauge. This is all it is. It's a real fine piece of like a compressible plastic. And when you put this in between a bearing, and its journal, it's going to compress down and expand. And then all you got to do is match it up to whatever size it matches up to on the little chart they give you. And then however tight or however big this compression is the measurement. And we're looking for 2 thou. A little bit tighter here is 3. There's 4 thou. 5, all the way down to 6 thou. So 6 thou means it's not really squeezing it that much, so it's not going to compress it that much. So we're going to hopefully be somewhere in between that 2 and 3 thou mark. Ideally, we want to be as close to that as we can. But this Plasti-Gauge is kind of, it's subjective to your eye. This is the one thing I don't like about it. For a quick reference, it does work pretty good, but we're going to see how accurate it gets to, what I've already measured with the mic. Math don't lie, but maybe your eyeball can. So what we got to do is take this, and that plastic is the whole length of this. You can buy it. You tear yourself off little pieces, but I'm going to add a little chunk to each journal, tighten the journals or main caps down. Then I got to remove them, and we'll do our measurement. Hopefully you can see that. We got our Plasti-Gauge in place there, right there. 3, 4, and 5 sitting down there in the shadow. All I did here was I had some pieces of rubber hose. I just put it over the ends of the main studs, just so I don't nick a journal when I'm dropping the crank down. You don't have to buy anything fancy. It's just a nice precaution if you're, the cranks are heavy, so you're kind of muscling the stuff around, but just a little precaution. But now we're going to torque this all down. You do not rotate the crank now. Not only is it dry, but you don't want to smear your Plasti-Gauge. So we're going to torque all this down, and then we'll see what our measurements are. everything's torqued up here. Did not rotate the crank. So now I get to undo all of that. And then the good part about everything being dry is that Plasti-Gauge should stay put on the crank surface. Hopefully we'll have a little smudge mark on the main, but we want to see the Plasti-Gauge on the crank. Doesn't always go as planned, but we'll have an impression on one or the other, the bearing or the journal. So now, well, I got all my main caps off. I actually decided to just take the studs out with the caps because that gave me, the stud gave me some leverage to get the caps off. As you see, it's a cross bolted mains. So the caps actually press down and they're kind of a, it's kind of a tight fit. So you can't just like lift them out. They're kind of wedged in there. So when you got the main studs, you just unthread them from the block until they're up a little bit. You can use them as a handle and wiggle the cap off. But I'm going to show you what I found here. And this kind of goes along with why I actually ended up buying the proper tools for measuring, because as you can see here, if you take our little chart here, we got a smudge on a crank. As you can see, it is compressed way beyond what would be a 2,000th reading. Let me get my camera in here a little better. You see, it's not off by a little bit, it's off by a lot. And this kind of goes, like I said, with the experience I've had with Plasti-Gauge in the past. Let's see if we can get on this one here. It's kind of hard to get the camera in here with my fat fingers. See, like this is why I say it's subjective, because you got to use your eye to match up what you're actually looking at. You can see that big red mark is 2 thou. It's compressed way past that 2 thou. See if I can get a light on one of these. We'll try this. You can see it's not even close. I don't know what to tell you as far as if you've been building motors with Plasti-Gauge. Like, I have used it in the past, but I've used it on stuff that had slightly sloppier, we'll say, clearances, like old school small block Chevy type stuff. It worked as a pretty good reference tool for that, but these newer models seem to, it's like the bike motors. They run at pretty tight oil tolerances. These newer vehicle motors kind of all do the same. So whether Plasti-Gauge is the right method for measuring, tighter clearance stuff, I'm going to say no. And I'm going to say it for the third time. This is why I've seen this before. This is why I bothered to buy those tools that I was using to actually get a numerical measurement for everything. The math doesn't lie. Compressing a piece of plastic and then using your eye to gauge it, and your only gauge is a full thousandth of an inch, when you're only running 2/1000 total clearance, your room for error can't be a full thou. So I'm going to suggest, again, get yourself some decent tools. This whole dial bore gauge set, I want to say $100. I think they're still on Amazon for about the same price. I bought this years ago. But you can get, this is a Fowler. It's a, not top of the line, but it's a reputable name. And then, like I said, the stuff I got in here, where would I put it? Oh, it's gone. Oh, it's in my vise. This mic that I've been using, that was $44, I think. And they work. You can They send you, I have multiple like gauge blocks that I can use for measuring and actually checking the accuracy of these. Even those gauge blocks and stuff, those aren't expensive. You don't have to have top of the line. But look at the peace of mind I got now knowing that I physically measured. I saw the numbers, the hard numbers on all these measurements. I know what the oil clearance is going to be. And oddly enough, because it's all standard stuff, uncut crank, uncut block, the block hasn't been line honed or nothing. I'm trying to say is nothing has been corrected for any kind of errors or defects. The bearings I'm using are, it's a higher quality bearing. The bearing tolerances are right on par. These clearances all came out exactly where they're supposed to be. So checking it was just kind of peace of mind to know that nothing was changed, nothing was wrong. So that's why I trust my physical measurements. Like when I was miking stuff, I had my hands were on that mic and I could feel the resistance of when I was too tight, too loose. Where's the right spot? There it is. Read the number. There's your physical number. Because math doesn't lie. Trust the science. If you get what I mean. So what I'm going to do now is probably clean this all back up because that Plasti-Gauge has got to come off the crank now. That's actually it's a plastic smudge on there. I'm going to clean the crank back up. I'm going to clean the bearings up. You can see, I should have showed you this because this would be easier to see. You see that smudge. You see that smudge on the bearing. That's all Plasti-Gauge does, is you're just trying to figure out where's the... This is why I should have said too, when you lay the Plasti-Gauge in there, you got to orient it so that it's laying a certain direction, so that you're not just trying to measure some random shaped blob. I know I had these laying in there perpendicular to the bearing, so I got to measure across the fattest spot with that little eyeball gauge, and hopefully we get something. But in this case, I don't trust Plasti-Gauge, and I'm going to say only use it as a reference. If you don't have measuring tools and you're just trying to double check some stuff, just use it as a reference tool. Get yourself some good measuring stuff so you know what you're doing, and it'll prolong the life of your project just knowing you did it right. So now I went through and I had that all disassembled. We Plasti-Gauged it. I cleaned everything again, get the Plasti-Gauge off. Then I went through and I put some oil on the bearings. I put the thrust bearing actually in the center. And I went through and I retorqued everything. And now that we're actually got some oil in there, we can move the crank. I'm going to suggest, or one of my tips, I should say, is I do this with the motorcycle motor too. When you're torquing your mains, bring them all up in stages. So these things get torqued to 80 foot-pounds. I started the first stage at 50. So I'll go through, I'll just run them all down till they're snug. I just took the impact and just zap them down, take the slack out. Then I'll torque the center main, bring it up to 50, give the crank a little wiggle. Go to the next one, torque it to 50, give the crank a wiggle. Every time you go through a torque stage, give the crank a little wiggle. That'll let you know if you got one main journal that maybe isn't quite in line with the rest, or there's something goofy going on, because it'll start pinching the crank. It'll try to cock it. There'll be something goofy going on, and you'll notice it with the bike motors too. If you got, maybe one bearing is a little tighter than the rest, something goofy going on, you'll find it as soon as you start bringing them up to the torque spec. If you give them a little wiggle after every journal that you do, just give, you don't have to like free spin the crank all the way around. Just make sure it's free. And now I went through, these get torqued 50, then 25 on the outside, the cross bolts, then up to 80 on the rest. And every time I did a torque on a main, I give the crank a wiggle, make sure it's loose. And now here's where we can confirm that the Plasti-Gauge was probably not real accurate. So my clearances here by math is only between 2 thou and 24 10,000ths. So 2 thou and just under 2.5 thou. So that Plasti-Gauge was showing by a lot that these clearances were tighter than that. Well, if you go much tighter than 2 thou, I don't believe you're going to get a crank to rotate by hand just off the snout. If that was much tighter than 2 thou, you know, if we were getting into a thou, there would be probably an issue with me turning. My hands are dirty, they're greasy. I can grip this slick, half polished snout, and that was gross right there. That was bad. I'm sorry I did that. But I can grab that snout and just rotate the crank. And there's oil in them journals, so there's oil resistance. There's a little bit of stiction going on, but you know, we got a good rotating crank, and I am confident in my math, micrometer, dial bore gauge measuring. We got the clearances where they need to be, and this is why, probably the 5th time I've said this now, this is the experience I've had with Plasti-Gauge. You get false readings, and then you get into a panic. Now you're trying to correct some sort of inaccurate measurement. On the motorcycle motors, we don't get a lot of room for error on those. There's not a lot of bearings to pick from. The bearing ranges are pretty tight, so you're not going to pick up a ton of clearance, or you know, tighten up a journal or loosen up a journal a ton. I mean, there's little ways to gain a little bit, but that was where I learned my experience with Plasti-Gauge. And maybe it's because the tolerances are so tight. Maybe that Plasti-Gauge is meant to just be used as a reference with bigger clearances. I don't know, but this is why I don't trust it. And I'm going to spin that crank again because, you know, it's the first sign of life this motor's had. I like that. So the next thing I'm going to do doesn't really go with the theme of this video, but I'm already in here measuring and checking stuff. I'm going to show you real quick how to check the thrust clearance on these things. Again, it's not super complicated. Simple measuring tools. You just got to have confidence in what you're doing. Do it often. Measure. Just buy yourself a micrometer and just go measure things around the house. Measure your silverware. I don't care. Just figure it out. Do something. Get proficient with what you're doing. Develop a feel. And all of this measuring becomes instantly less stressful and more accurate. So real quick, I'm going to show you how to check thrust bearing clearance on a Gen 3 Hemi. It's not complicated. All right. Hopefully you can see what I got going on here. Again, we just got my magnetic base indicator stand. Indicator set up here. It's just touching the end of the crank. And we got our, let me zero that out a little better. There. We got our indicator right here zeroed out. You want to zero it after, I'm just using a screwdriver here. So I want to go between a main cap and one of the throws of the crank. Just make sure you're prying the crank. I hate to use the word pry. You're manipulating the crank to the rear. You want it to go that way. That's when you zero your gauge. Now all I'm going to do is go to the other side over here. See me over here with the screwdriver? Between the main cap and that journal throw. And we're going to watch our dial indicator. And we're just going to see what she reads. From 0, how much she moves over. Right there. We are at just about 2.5 thou. That is like perfect. I think the spec is between 2 to 4. So we're right in tolerance. So that's, again, simple tools. I bet you there's $30 in equipment here. And you can check thrust on anything, even with the bike motors. There's a thrust bearing in there, and you need to check that end play. I'm going to use both fingers. You're going to use that end play, that side-to-side thrust movement. You got to measure and make sure that's right, and that crank's not walking around on you. So now we know this crank, we're confident in our oil clearances, and now we're confident in our thrust bearing clearance. So this crank is ready to go. Now I just need those magical connecting pieces for in here that I said I wouldn't mention. And we're going to send this whole assembly out to get balanced now. And hopefully, word has it on the street is that I'll have a tracking number for those missing parts today, Monday. And that means if I get a tracking number, they're on their way. And by next weekend, we could be putting this thing together for good if I can get her balanced in time. So one thing I've been doing, I thought would be kind of cool, is I've actually been clocking in my labor on this project to keep track with just the date, quick note of what I was doing and how many hours I spent doing it. When this is all said and done, I'm going to be interested to see what I pull off here for labor. And then I've also been keeping track of my parts costs, kind of what I got, and then doing just totals as I go. But currently, as of today, and I'm going to end this video, I'm at, well, here's the breakdown. On March 4th, I blew the motor up in the 5.7. 12th, I bought the 6.1 block, and you can see we just keep going down. We're 45 hours of labor in. All my good notes there. And if we come over here, this is when I started buying parts. I got a smoking ass good buddy breakdown deal on the $300 block. You won't find them for that. So this, when it's all said and done, that number is going to be kind of an but that's what I paid for it. So we're breaking it down, all the parts, just random, everything. Seals, lifters, head bolts, gaskets, dowels. Our grand total to this point, and this is today's date, is March 28th. $5,242.29 in parts. I'm not tallying up the total price for like buying tools or whatever. That's separate. But when we're all said and done, I'm going to do a whole breakdown on what this thing cost. And as far as getting done what I've got done so far, 45 hours of labor, I think I'm doing pretty good. So that wraps up another one. Again, hopefully you learned a little bit of something there. I'm not going to totally badmouth Plasti-Gauge. I don't trust it. This, like I said, this piece I have here, I've had this for, I bet you I've been moving it around shop to shop for almost 20 years at this point, because that's how long ago it's been since I had my small block Chevy drag car that I was, running, and I used Plasti-Gauge on it. Oddly enough, I didn't have a lot of success with that motor. But either way, I can't preach it enough. Go get some measuring tools, learn how to use them, and be a little more confident in your project. So I think we'll wrap this one up as saying that we'll call this the proper way, and we'll call this the Illinois way. So that's pretty fitting that this is representative of Illinois. I know you guys like the Illinois jokes. I know they're still watching too, so we'll see you in the next video.